They thought a petty HOA fine would make me bow down to their power-hungry demands, not knowing they just picked a fight with the chief of police. But what happens when I uncover their illegal operation targeting our community's hard-working first responders and decide it's time for the hunter to become the hunted? Welcome to my channel. Comment below where you're watching from. I'll never forget that morning. It started just like any other day but ended up changing our whole neighborhood forever. As I walked out to my car, ready for another day at the police station, I spotted something bright green stuck under my windshield wiper. At first, I thought it was just another takeout menu, but my heart sank when I realized it was an HOA violation notice, $79 for improper lawn maintenance. You've got to be kidding me. I stood there in my uniform, coffee in hand, staring at my lawn. It looked exactly like it had for the past 15 years I'd lived here, green, healthy, and recently mowed. Sure, maybe it wasn't perfect like a golf course, but it was neat and well maintained. That's when I heard the distinct sound of high heels clicking on the sidewalk. "Good morning." The voice was sugary sweet but had an edge to it that made my teeth hurt. Karen Mitchell, our newest HOA board member, was doing her morning inspection walk with her tablet in hand. She'd moved in 6 months ago and immediately started campaigning for a board position. Now, 3 weeks into her role, she was making everyone's life miserable. "Miss Mitchell." I nodded politely, holding up the notice. "Mind explaining this? My lawn meets all reasonable standards." She barely looked up from her tablet. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the HOA Guidelines clearly states that grass height must not exceed 3 inches. Yours is approximately 3.5. She said this while tapping away at her screen, probably documenting another violation somewhere. I took a deep breath, remembering my training in dealing with difficult people. I've been a bit busy this week with a major case at work. I'll mow it this weekend. "Rules are rules," she chirped, finally looking up. "The fine doubles if not paid within 72 hours. Oh, and you might want to do something about those garden gnomes. They're not on the approved decoration list." My garden gnomes, the ones my late wife had collected. I felt my blood pressure rising but kept my voice steady. I wasn't aware we needed approval for garden decorations that have been here for over a decade. "New board, new rules." She waved her tablet cheerfully. "We're bringing this neighborhood into the modern age. No more tacky decorations lowering property values." As she clicked away down the sidewalk, I noticed she was stopping at Sarah's house next door. Sarah was an ER nurse who had just finished a grueling night shift. The last thing she needed was Karen's morning harassment about her garbage bins being out too long. I watched as Karen started taking photos of Sarah's property, and something inside me shifted. This wasn't just about my lawn or my gnomes anymore. In my 25 years of law enforcement, I'd learned to spot patterns of harassment and abuse of power. Karen wasn't just being strict, she was targeting specific residents. Back in my car, I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through the neighborhood Facebook group. The complaints about Karen were piling up. Mark, the firefighter on the corner, had been fined for his kid's basketball hoop. The elderly couple across the street got a violation for their unapproved rose bushes. Even the local teacher had been cited for parking his car in his own driveway because it was too old and unsightly. I was about to pull out of my driveway when I spotted Karen taking more pictures of my gnomes. She didn't know it yet, but she just made a serious mistake. See, being chief of police had taught me one very important thing: sometimes the biggest crimes aren't the ones that make headlines but the small injustices that chip away at a community's spirit. As I drove to work, my mind was already forming a plan. Karen thought she had all the power, but she had no idea who she was really dealing with. Dr. Thompson's car was at the emergency room entrance. He was rushing in for a critical surgery. My blood boiled, but I kept my cool. This was the final piece I needed. I sat back in my chair, looking at the wall of evidence I'd gathered. Karen had no idea what was coming. In her rush to build her little kingdom of power, she'd left a trail of violations that would shock even her supporters on the HOA board. The real question now was timing. when and how to present this information for maximum impact. A text message lit up my phone screen. It was from one of my sergeants. Karen just submitted a proposal for expanded security measures. Emergency HOA meeting called for tomorrow night. I smiled, knowing the perfect moment had just presented itself. Sometimes, the best investigations are the ones where you let your target walk right into the trap they've set for others. Walking into that HOA meeting, my heart was pounding, but I kept my face calm. Karen stood at the front of the room in her designer suit, waving around a stack of papers about her new community safety program. I watched as she talked about hiring more security guards and adding cameras on every street. The whole room seemed tired of her rules, but everyone was too scared to speak up. I waited until she finished her speech about protecting our property values. Then, just as she asked for votes, I raised my hand. The familiar weight of my badge in my pocket gave me strength. "Before we vote," I said, standing up slowly, "I think there's something everyone needs to know." Karen's eyes narrowed, not recognizing me out of uniform. "I'm Chief Anderson, and I've been investigating some concerning issues." I pulled out my own stack of papers, property records, business licenses, and photos. The projector clicked on, showing Karen's illegal home business setup, clear as day. "These pictures show an unlicensed daycare operation running out of your house, Mrs. Mitchell. That's against both HOA rules and state regulations." Karen's face turned red. "How dare you? This is private property." "Public records aren't private," I replied calmly, changing to the next slide. "Neither is this business registration showing your brother owns Safe Shield Security, the same company now patrolling our streets without proper licensing." The room erupted in whispers. I continued. "While you've been fining Sarah Thompson, our local ER nurse, for leaving her trash bins out an extra hour after her night shifts, you've been running an illegal business. While you cited Mark Rodriguez's kids for their basketball hoop, your security company has been operating without permits." Mrs. Chin from down the street stood up. "She fined me $200 for my Chinese New Year decorations." Others joined in, sharing their stories of Karen's targeted harassment. Karen tried to grab her papers and storm out, but the HOA president, Mr. Jenkins, blocked the door. "Not so fast, Karen. We need to discuss this." I shared evidence of every unfair fine, every made-up rule, and every double standard. The room got louder with each revelation. Parents who'd been fined for their kids' chalk drawings spoke up. Senior citizens shared how they'd been harassed about their garden gnomes and bird baths. "And here's the biggest problem," I said, showing the final slide. "The security company has been writing tickets and blocking driveways without any legal authority to do so. That's impersonating law enforcement, a serious offense." Karen's perfect mask finally cracked. "You can't prove anything. I was making this neighborhood better. These people need rules." "Rules apply to everyone," I replied, "including you." The room burst into applause. Mr. Jenkins called for an emergency vote, and hands shot up across the room. Karen wasn't just removed from the board, she was banned from ever serving again. As she finally pushed past everyone to leave, she turned back, tears of rage in her eyes. "This isn't over," she shouted. But looking at our united neighbors, I knew it was. Sometimes, justice wears a badge. And sometimes, it just needs someone to stand up and tell the truth. I walked into that HOA meeting room with every piece of evidence carefully organized in my folder. The room was packed. I'd never seen so many neighbors show up before. Karen sat at the front table, tapping away at her tablet like she owned the place. She didn't even look up when I entered. "Before we vote on the new security measures," I announced, standing up from my seat in the back, "I'd like to address the board." Karen's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing as I walked to the front. "For those who don't know me, I'm James Mitchell. I've lived here for 15 years, and I'm also the chief of police for our city." The whispers started immediately. Karen's tablet slipped from her hands, clattering on the table. I could see her brother, the security company owner, shifting uncomfortably in his chair by the door. Over the past 3 months, there have been 47 fines issued in our community. 35 of them were given to first responders and essential workers. I pulled out my first piece of evidence, a color-coded map showing every cited house. Notice any pattern? The board members leaned forward, studying the clusters of red dots. Mrs. Thompson, our retired school principal and longest-serving board member, adjusted her glasses with trembling hands. But that's not all, I continued, pulling out more documents. The security company hired to enforce these citations, Mitchell Security LLC, isn't just unlicensed, it's operating illegally under our state's private security contractor laws. Karen's brother stood up, heading for the door, but 2 uniformed officers I'd stationed outside were already waiting. Karen jumped to her feet. This is ridiculous. You can't use police resources for personal vendettas. You're right, I smiled. That's why everything I'm presenting tonight came from public records and legal channels, including the documents showing your home-based business that violates Section 7 of our HOA agreement. The room erupted. Neighbors started sharing their own stories, the single mom fined for Christmas lights in January while working double shifts, the elderly couple targeted for their medical equipment delivery van, the kindergarten teacher cited for children's chalk drawings on her own driveway. Mrs. Thompson stood up, her voice cutting through the chaos. I moved to immediately remove Karen Mitchell from the board and launch a full audit of all fines issued under her authority. Second, 5 voices called out at once. Karen's face had turned from red to white. You can't do this. I was protecting property values. I was maintaining standards. No, I said quietly. You were bullying people who didn't have time to fight back. But that ends today. The vote was unanimous. As Karen stormed out, her designer handbag swinging wildly, neighbors started hugging each other. Sarah, the ER nurse who'd received 8 citations, was crying as she hugged Mark, the firefighter who'd nearly lost his kid's basketball hoop. I stayed late, helping Mrs. Thompson start the paperwork to refund every unfair fine. We found over $115,000 worth of citations, each one more ridiculous than the last. The next morning, I drove to work past Karen's house. A moving truck was already in her driveway. Her brother's security vehicles were gone, too, replaced by legitimate patrol cars making sure the moving company had proper permits. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. People started coming out again. Kids played in their yards without fear of citations. Mrs. Thompson organized a community barbecue to celebrate the return of common sense. But the best moment came a week later. I was watering my lawn, exactly 3.5 inches tall, when Sarah's daughter ran up with a handmade card. Inside was a crayon drawing of me in my police uniform, standing in front of a rainbow-colored house. The message read, "Thank you for making our neighborhood happy again." That card sits on my desk at the station now, reminding me that sometimes, the most important police work happens right at home. Our community learned a valuable lesson. It's not about having power, it's about how you use it. And as for Karen? Last I heard, she tried to join another HOA board 2 towns over. But somehow, they'd already heard all about her experience with us.